It also led in the campaign of 1828 to probably the dirtiest campaign, presidential campaign in American history. Sometimes a lot of people think that politics today is low and dirty. Politics today is patty cake compared to politics in days past. In large part now because everything that a candidate says, just about everything that a candidate thinks, or certainly anything that a candidate emails, is recorded by somebody, and they know it can be used against them. But in the earlier times, nobody had tape recorders, nobody took notes, nobody had telephone cameras. So candidates could say one thing to this audience and another thing to that audience. And their spokesman could say something over here and another spokesman could say something over there. Well, the campaign against Jackson became a campaign against Rachel. And Rachel's name was dragged through the mud. She was described as a bigamist, an adulteress, a prostitute, a whore, every nasty thing that you could imagine. And Jackson by this time was in a position where he couldn't duel with everybody who was saying these bad things because most of the bad things were said anonymously. It was the equivalent of sort of rumors on the internet. Kind of the Matt Drudge report sort of thing. And so handbills were circulated, nobody put their names on them. And Jackson had to sort of silently suffer this stuff. And Rachel had to suffer it as well. Rachel never liked the fact that her husband went into politics. And the campaign of 1828 was emotionally devastating to her. She suffered a nervous breakdown. And then the nervous breakdown led to a physical breakdown, and she died under the strain. She died just days after Andrew Jackson was elected President of the United States. This was Jackson's moment of greatest political and personal triumph. And he suffered his deepest personal tragedy. He almost could not bring himself to go from Nashville to Washington to become president. And the only thing that finally decided him to make the trip, to accept this responsibility and honor that the American people handed him, was a desire to get back at his enemies, his political enemies, the people who had killed Rachel. Okay, this is background. Because I guess it's kind of sort of deep background, but anyway. When John Eaton said that he had fallen in love with Peggy Eaton, as she would become, and when Jackson heard that people were saying bad things about Peggy Eaton's reputation, how she had grown up in a tavern. Her father was a tavern owner. And her father apparently was not above, she was very attractive. And her father was not above using her attractiveness to draw in guests, to bring business to the tavern. And whether she was simply flirtatious or more than flirtatious, well, none could say definitively, but a lot of people speculated on. She married a man who was in the U.S. Navy, who was shipped off and stationed far away. And when he was stationed far away, he committed suicide. And nobody could know why he committed suicide exactly. Was it because of the fact that Peggy had been cheating on him? Was it the fact that Peggy had, fallen in love with John Eaton? Was that the story? Well, that's the story that was circulated. And Peggy Eaton was generally conceived to be a woman of low reputation, a woman without virtue. But John Eaton loved her. And John Eaton asked Andrew Jackson, should they get married? And Jackson said, if you love her, marry her. I'll stand by you. You stood by me during the war. And so they were married. The rumors about Peggy Eaton never stopped. In fact, after John Eaton became Secretary of War and Andrew Jackson became president, the rumors about Peggy Eaton simply got louder and more shrill. And Jackson's political enemies, he had lots of political enemies, and some of these enemies included, enemies at this point might be too strong a word, his rivals. There were members of his own party who were rivals, members of his cabinet who were jockeying for position, who were jockeying for the successorship, for the succession to Jackson. They included John Calhoun, who was his vice president. John Calhoun managed the remarkable feat of jumping from the sinking administration of John Quincy Adams to the rising administration of Andrew Jackson. Meanwhile, though, being fundamentally disloyal to everything that Andrew Jackson believed about the nature of the Federal Union. It was John Calhoun who would organize the effort on the part of South Carolina to nullify, that is to forbid the enforcement of a tariff bill, a tariff of 1828, that led to the first secession crisis in American history. And, that's going to be another lecture. That's not tonight. Anyway, then what really complicated the whole issue was when the wives got involved. Because the wives of the members of Jackson's cabinet refused to attend parties where Peggy Eaton would be. They refused to have anything to do with a woman who had such a checkered reputation. This infuriated Jackson. It dismayed John Eaton. And it caused Jackson's, what shall I say, his shrewd political advisors to say, you know, Mr. President, you got to do something about this. You know, you're going to have to get rid of your Peggy Eaton problem. You're going to have to get rid of John Eaton. Because John Eaton's not going to give up on his wife. You can't ask him to do that. But you know, nobody has a constitutional right to be Secretary of War. It was a fine thing that you offered him the job, but now he's become a burden to the administration. And in the interest of your policies, in the interest of everything that you were elected for, you got to cut John Eaton loose. And Jackson said no. Jackson insisted on this policy, this principle of personal loyalty. John Eaton has been loyal to me, I will be loyal to John Eaton. And this Peggy Eaton affair, as it was described, went on and on and on. And it paralyzed Jackson's administration for over a year. Nothing happened for the first year of Jackson's administration. And this was an administration that came in with a mandate to effect important changes. This was the first people's president. And Jackson couldn't get anything done because he couldn't even get his own cabinet to agree on anything. And he couldn't get Congress to go along with this, all because of the affair of Peggy Eaton. Well, I shouldn't use the word affair in this context, because of the matter of Peggy Eaton, the love of John Eaton for Peggy Eaton, and the loyalty of Andrew Jackson for John Eaton. Now, eventually, John Eaton took it upon himself to resign. He realized that he had become a burden to the man he admired more than anybody else, his second father, the President of the United States, and he resigned. But Jackson refused to let it go at that because he realized that if Eaton resigned under these circumstances, then his enemies would win. And they would have proved their point that they could run a member of the President's cabinet out of office. So Jackson managed to, persuade other men, probably the whole cabinet, to resign. And that way it would be clear that it wasn't just John Eaton. It was represented as a house cleaning. Okay. This is a long version of how a president can be too loyal to an individual. Now, I'm going to tell you about the flip side of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson could be loyal to a fault. He could be too good a friend. He also could be too good an enemy. Andrew Jackson had friends. He had enemies. Among his enemies were, Henry Clay, John Calhoun. Henry Clay should have been an ally. This is where sort of just call it you decide if envy is a petty emotion or not. But it's an emotion that drives a lot of people. And it drove Henry Clay away from Andrew Jackson.